Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Spoiler Warning Podcast. This is review number 588 with a review of Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I'm Christopher Schnese.
And I'm Stephen Miller.
And if you're joining us for the first time, the Spoiler Warning Podcast is a weekly film review program. Each week on the show, we're going to dive in, debate, discuss, and argue over the latest film releases coming to a theater near you. This week, it is finally here. Stephen saw this last year at Cannes.
Yeah, like 10 months ago at this point.
And we've been waiting for it to come out here in San Francisco, and it finally came out this week, even though our local Alamo Drafthouse, Drink Carson, did not friggin' open this film this week. But yeah, if you listen to our review of Birds of Prey, and you listened all the way to the end, you heard us whisper about how our next review would be of Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
Truly the birds of prey of this Oscar season.
But yeah, this is a film that the critics have definitely loved, and have been talking about it for a while, and I think that myself, and I mean, Stephen had already seen it, but of course he was excited to see it again, and I think a lot of people that are sort of following the film industry were probably pretty excited to see Portrait of a Lady on Fire this weekend, and it is finally here, so we are going to bring you that review. We're also going to have a review of The Assistant, which Stephen had heard some interesting conversations about, maybe. But basically, on Friday, Stephen texted me and was like, hey, by the way, I'm also going to try to see The Assistant this weekend. So I was like, sure, I'm game. I'll go see it, and we'll be able to put out a review after this one. But yeah, we are not going to take too much more time. We are going to just jump right into this review. We're going to take a listen to the trailer for Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and then we're going to come back and give you guys a review.
Je suis peintre. L'homme intéressé par ma fille est milanais. Nous partons là-bas si le portrait lui plaît. Il a épuisé déjà un peintre avant vous.
Que s'est-il passé? Je ne sais pas. Elle vous attend.
Ça fait des années que je rêve de faire ça. Mourir. Courir.
Vous allez devoir la peindre sans qu'elle le sache. Elle pense que vous êtes une compagne de promenade pour quelques jours.
Que savez-vous de mon futur mariage?
Rien.
C'est tout ce que j'en sais aussi. Quand allez-vous vous marier?
Je ne sais pas si je vais me marier.
C'est parce que vous pouvez choisir que vous ne me comprenez pas.
Je vous comprends. Quand vous êtes embarrassé, vous mordez vos lèvres.
Vraiment. Quand vous êtes troublé, vous respirez par la bouche. Combien de temps restez-vous?
Je ne sais pas.
J'ai un nouveau sentiment. Le regret.
Quel en est le titre?
Portrait de la jeune fille en feu.
All right, so that was the trailer for Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Basically, this film takes place in a time that was before swiping left or right. Mm-hmm. And basically, if you wanted to find yourself a wife,
you had to swipe down.
You would hire somebody to paint a portrait of a woman that you may want to be betrothed to, and then they'd send you that photo, and you would look at it and decide, hey, I think I'm going to marry this woman. And this story follows a painter who is sent to... Is it an island? She definitely hops on a boat.
I believe it's an island off the coast of France.
Okay, so it's an island off the coast of France. She is sent there to meet this woman and paint a portrait of her. However, the catch is that this woman doesn't like being portraited, and she has to, in secret, paint a portrait of her. And that's sort of the experience she has on this island meeting this woman. Stephen Miller, obviously you are a fan of this film. Mm-hmm. You saw this a while back, but you're re-seeing it now. Would you like to tell us a little bit about why you are fond of this film?
So I felt similarly to this, how I did with Parasite when it was going wide, where I felt very strongly, but I also didn't know how it would play when a trailer reveals what the film will be about. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that this is a romance. I feel like that is how this film is being marketed to the general audience, and it came out on Valentine's Day for a reason. But
because they didn't want to fucking release it sooner than that.
Of course. But when I watched this movie at Cannes, I knew nothing except for this is called... I didn't even know Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I knew the French name, which meant whatever. I knew it had lady in the title, right? Otherwise, I was just watching a period piece and watching it unfold over time, like as the filmmaker wanted it to happen. And there was something about this movie at the time I was watching it that it had this sort of crescendo of romance to it that I didn't expect. Like, it builds and builds and kind of snowballs over time. And I was a little reluctant when I would recommend it throughout the year because I knew this worked on me very well, but I have no idea how it will play in a market where people are expecting a French Call Me By Your Name, right? Like a queer romance period piece set in France, because that's just different from being surprised by a movie where partway through you learn it is a love story, where before that you didn't really know what you were going to get. You know, it's kind of very different framing.
You're working from the surprise of where it's going versus the I am waiting for this to catch on to this love story.
Exactly, yeah. And what really surprised me is my memory of this film is so much more overtly like sensual and erotic than the movie actually is. In my memory, this is like up there with Blue is the Warmest Color in like very sexual, very romantic, like long scenes of two people falling in love. That was my memory of this movie. In reality, the actual romance on screen doesn't happen till like 2/3 of the way through the film, and it only gets a couple scenes. There's actually very little that is overtly sexual in this movie. And yet in my memory, it was huge. It was kind of like it eclipsed everything else. It was such a romantic, sensual film about falling in love. And I think I realized watching it a second time that what this movie really is about the memory of love. It's about the feeling that you have.
Which is the song from Call Me By Your Name.
No, it is a lot like Call Me By Your Name in that it's about the feeling you have when love has passed, when this ephemeral thing has happened. How will you choose to remember it? And I think what I really appreciated in this movie is how much that first half, that first 2/3 is doing to set the groundwork not for... So in a typical romance, the first half would be foreplay, right? It's like building you up for this inevitable release of tension that you're going to get, and it's trying to like set all the gears in motion so when it happens you feel like overwhelmed by the need for this to happen. I would say Call Me By Your Name is kind of like that, where it sets up all the pieces and then you know they are going to come together, and when it finally happens it's going to feel like a rush of endorphin because we've been seeing them interact awkwardly for a while, so we know what it's going to feel when they finally come together. This movie is so much about memory. Like there's a big conversation in the middle of the movie about the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, of the couple that basically has to go through Hades, and Orpheus is told just don't look back. It's very much like the biblical story of Lot and his wife, right? Like if you look back, she'll be turned into a pillar of salt, so don't look back. And the big question is, why do they look back? Why do they do this even though they were given a simple instruction? If they did it, it would work. And in this movie, there's a conversation in the middle of the film where every character has a kind of different opinion about it, where one says, this is just, he was so in love, he couldn't help but look back. And then the other says, maybe he made the poet's choice. Maybe he chose to look back because he would prefer the memory of the thing to the reality of the thing itself. And then the third character says maybe she told him to look back. Like maybe she would rather be remembered than live in this world where she'll become forgotten again. And I think so much of this movie, it's building up this idea of how big love will be in your memory in hindsight, that it pulls off, for me, a kind of magic trick where it like the love story in the text of the movie is there, but it is not that huge. But in my memory, it is enormous. Like it was huge. And I think it has something to do with the way the movie is framing your your view on love and your view of the unattainable, like the thing that you had for a few days and then you knew you had to leave. Which is a very long-winded way of saying that I love this movie on second viewing.
I can see how actually the journey the second time allows you to get more enriched experience through it, because the first time you watched it, you had no idea what you were watching in general, and you watched the slow progression of two people sort of becoming fond of each other and then working towards building a memory that may last them a while. And the second time, you really got a chance to dive into the dialogue itself in the in-between scenes. Like that whole Orpheus stuff, like that is something that did not even register to me, A, because I don't really have the historical knowledge of the Orpheus story, and B, because like it's a random scene in the middle of a film that is doing a lot of different things.
Right.
So it is interesting to see like that. Like for me to be able to relive this film through your eyes, having seen it a second time, is kind of an interesting juxtaposition through the experience of myself. A, knowing ahead of time the story I will be watching, and B, watching it for the first time versus the second time.
So we'll talk about the ghost scenes in this movie after you say how you feel, because it ties in a lot to the Orpheus story too.
Okay.
But what's interesting is my memory, because we talked about this film a couple times. When I saw it at Cannes, I called in that night, I think, and I mentioned it.
You had
kind of
just
in passing.
gotten out of it, right?
Yeah, I said, "Oh shit, I forgot Portrait of a Lady on Fire." I think I love this movie. I don't know what to say about it.
Yeah.
My memory of this movie was all romance and no detail at all. And it was just interesting to revisit it and realize how much this film is doing that is not explicitly romantic. I think the actresses are both great in this film. They do a good job of showing. There are two different characters in a period piece, where one is the independent woman who has the ability to choose a life for herself, but has also not been able to see much of the world. And then the character who is kind of the stereotypical kind of character in the nunnery, right? The one who is like guarded away from the world and hasn't gotten to experience
the young
yet.
assistant sort of girl, no relation to the film that we're going to be talking about.
No relationship. But you have her, and then you have the daughter, the kind of cloistered, wealthy woman who has not. All of them, much like Call Me by Your Name, like they don't know anything that quote matters yet. You know, they haven't really gotten to experience these things. And I just love the way this movie, it takes its time. It is definitely a movie that rewards patience. It is not a movie that will move from scene to scene with any kind of urgency. It is trying to paint a picture of what life would be like for these people, and then show you what wanting looks like. And I think what is really lovely about this movie is the way it frames it in terms of painting, where it's about observing people, observing the little details, like how one hand will clutch the other hand, or about how a person will move their cheek a little bit when they laugh, or like getting little glimpses of what a person is and falling in love with that, with the memory of what adds up to the sum whole of a person. I thought on second viewing especially, it was really nice to just watch that for what it was, knowing where it was going. I knew it was going to build up to a crescendo of an ending that I love. Like I knew the last 5 minutes of this movie are going to get me no matter what.
Yeah.
So I could just kind of enjoy the details for what they were without caring what they were building towards. And yeah, I just think it's a really lovely movie about memory and about how the nostalgia you have for your first love, or the forbidden love, or the one that couldn't work, can grow so big in your mind that it can outweigh everything else, and it can kind of like propel the rest of one's life when they think about it.
Yeah.
And I just think this is a wonderfully romantic movie that, it worked on me wonderfully a second time. And we'll talk about ghosts, and we'll talk about the song and a couple other things after I hear your thoughts.
Do we want to have an explicit spoiler section, or do you think
I don't think we need to. I think we can talk around it.
So I guess the best way to talk about this film from my standpoint is to first I want to just rip the Band-Aid off and say not all of this film worked for me the way it did sort of as a whole for you. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that I disliked the entire thing, but it was a little bit hard for me to grasp everything that this film was doing. But what I do want to do is praise some very beautiful and magical things in this film. I think that there's a lot of... First of all, I'm not super familiar with French filmmaking, so I don't have a lot of stuff to compare it to. So I don't know how much of this is like typical French filmmaking and how much of it is just this film doing this thing. But I think that for myself, maybe the thesis of the film and where it goes to at the end, like those last 5 minutes that you're talking about, just blew me away. I love the end of this film. This film nails a landing.
It sticks the landing.
Yeah,
real
it
well.
sticks the landing amazingly. While it was in the air, I was like, "There's no way they're going to land this. This is Jesus Christ. She's going to get real hurt." Like nothing about the story, but I mean, like I'm taking the metaphor full bore and thinking of a gymnast tumbling through the air, hoping she's going to land when I know she hurt her leg on that last vault.
I gotcha.
Shout out to the Olympics, like 20 years ago or whatever it was. But anyways, the point being, like the entire journey didn't completely work for me. But I think sort of the lead into this film and the crescendo and the end of this film are very, very beautiful, and maybe some ghost things really, really worked for me in this film. And we're talking about ghost imagery, not literal ghosts. Yeah. So we're not spoiling anything. This isn't like suddenly a horror film or anything like that.
This isn't Personal Shopper.
Yeah, this is not Personal Shopper. But like Personal Shopper, I might like it even more upon second viewing. Mm-hmm. But I will say that one of the things that I found most interesting about this film is based on the simple premise of the film, which is one woman is coming here to meet this character, is supposed to paint her without being able to have her pose and paint for her, which means somebody is intently studying another person. And in any sort of, meet cute or relationship beginnings, two people meeting where there's some sort of chemistry there are subtle things that you pick up about a person noticing you or a person interacting with you that you can either interpret as one thing or another. And I think that in this film, you have a character who, by her job, needs to intently study the physicality and the look and the presence of another being. And that person, in receiving those looks and glances, like this dance of these two people noticing each other, mm-hmm. but for different reasons, and how that plays, and sort of how the experience of these two interacting with each other could lead to more than was maybe potentially intentioned at the beginning of their encounter. That I thought was a very interesting concept. And like, as that was happening, watching it through the artist's eyes and seeing a person commit to memory the subtle curves of somebody's, neck or chin or whatever, like I really, really thought that was an interesting concept. Mm-hmm. And I think that over time that sort of gets abandoned and it sort of becomes a fleeting sort of idea. And it sort of, I was kind of all wrapped up in this idea of like, oh wow, that's very interesting to see this sort of like subtle play that these two people have, but they don't really know why the other person is paying attention to that person. Like, there's something about that I really thought was an interesting concept and idea. Yeah. And then when that went away, I sort of was like, oh, okay, fine. Well, now we'll just go into this as we're going now. And then if I can scoot towards the end, there are things that happen in that story that just, I think, like, okay, so I'm not foreign to the idea of a very truncated time spending with a person, having that leave a lasting impression on you.
Right. We all saw Duck Butter.
No, but I mean, like, it's not like I don't believe that the short amount of time these people could have with each other could form this lasting thing that sort of lives on after their encounter with each other. But I think that this story is, I feel like the story we are watching is from the point of the painter, but the reality of the existence of those two characters, it is sort of the portraitee. I don't know what's the word for the person being painted. The person being painted sort of is leading the life that would require her to long more for the thing that we are watching the film about. Mm-hmm. If I can compare it to a film which we didn't like that much that we saw at Tribeca a few years ago, Disobedience, right? Mm. So in that film, it is a story of forbidden love and a person who exists in a culture for which she has to deny her actual self and has to pretend she doesn't have these feelings that she has. And while we didn't think that was a particularly well-made film, it is doing a very specific thing, which is circumstances require somebody to ignore who it is that they are. And I think that in this film, one of the characters is betrothed and has to marry unless some magical thing intervenes. But the character that the story is being told from the point of view could have gone on and loved again if she so chose to.
Right.
So I think that while the story does have a beautiful coda to it, I think that, like, the reality of this, like, I feel that the only way that a love like this persists throughout time is if it's not replaced by another love. Mm-hmm. And I think that the character who we're seeing this film through the eyes of is the one who has the option to love again. Yeah. So because it's being told of this like lost love, I feel like it's the wrong person telling the story. I don't know. There is something that didn't jive with me completely, because she is the character who is not stuck in the position where she couldn't love again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I buy that. And I think that is true. So the character names, I think, are Marianne and Eloise, where Eloise is the woman who is to be married and Marianne is the portrait artist who is there to paint her. And I think I agree with you that for Marianne, it is not clear that this was the one love, the only love. I think the film pushes you toward that a little bit, but I do think the movie is more about Eloise and how it would feel for her. And I think even the feelings in the final scene have to do with projecting onto Eloise, like, what that would feel like. But I think I do agree with you that this person is teed up to kind of live a life that she wants to live and potentially experience more in her life that would dwarf, because I kind of am in the same boat with this and with Romeo and Juliet and with standard stories when I'm like, well, okay, you spent a week together.
Titanic.
How great could it be? Like, come on. What is the thing that cannot be replaced? Like, I get that with love stories also. Like, my pragmatist self comes into play and kind of feels like it is maybe outweighing it. And that's why watching this movie a second time, the way it emphasizes memory and the choice of leaving someone and the weight that will carry. There's a famous poem called Ode on a Grecian Urn that is all kind of about a picture of two people looking at each other who are about to kiss but have not kissed yet. And the ode is kind of about how that is the best moment in life, is before the thing happens, the moment of anticipation for this great thing that will happen. Yeah. How that's going to outweigh everything else, because how lucky are they, right? Like, they get to be...
Is that the poem about whether or not you ask out the girl who is your friend that you've been friends with for a long
time? Yes, ode on a friend zone. But the idea behind that poem, I think it's by Keats, is that, like, you know, the best moment in any kind of romance is that moment of anticipation before you know the outcome.
Yeah.
And how the memory of that, if you could just freeze time there and live there forever, that would be the most romantic experience in the world.
Yeah.
And I think this movie is living on that level, where it is saying that the fact that this love could not be, and the memory of it as this unattainable thing that you are walking away from and choosing to get one glimpse of before leaving, I think that is the thrust of it. And it is true. I think the literal details of the romance kind of fade compared to that in this movie.
Yeah. So this film is divided into two chunks, I'll say. One is, I'll call the two chunks rough draft and finished product. Mm-hmm. Right? There's two parts of this film. If the characters were able to skip directly to finished product, would there even be a romance? Because I feel like this film, there is a sort of artistic rejection that happens partway through this film, mm-hmm. which triggers the actual romance to begin kindling itself, right. Until the lady is on fire.
Good fire word.
Thank you. But I feel like I think part of, I feel, I think that's why I struggle with the interesting concept of the first part of the film, where it is not two people immediately drawn to each other. It's one person intently studying another, and then the other person slowly warming up to the person A. Mm-hmm. And I think that because of that interesting concept, I forego the lack of chemistry at the beginning of this film. And then later on in the film, obviously there's chemistry. These two have great chemistry together.
Right.
But the context for which we are viewing them is one of them sitting there quietly staring at the other one while the other one purposely doesn't talk to them. Which is, I guess that's playing hard to get in whatever year this film is supposed to be set in.
Yeah.
But it sort of lacks that sort of interaction that makes you feel like, damn, these two should be together because I want to ship them or whatever, right? It feels more like two distinct, disjointed parts where it requires the mother to sail off for 5 days in order for them to sort of build towards this romance, which I think sort of pulled me out of the story a little bit.
Yeah, I can see that. So it is worth saying that Adèle Haenel, who plays the daughter who is to be wed in this movie, is the actual partner of the director, Céline Sciamma.
Okay.
So I think some of that, the chemistry is actually brought to bear because the director is actually in a relationship with this woman. So it's a very kind of like personal way that the camera looks at this person.
Yeah.
So I can see that. And I do think, again, I mentioned the romance in a literal sense takes up much less weight of this movie than my memory of it was. And I think it's because kind of like Call Me By Your Name, I think this movie, and Carol for that matter, I don't know why like queer period piece love stories in particular seem to do this, where it is less about the two people to me than it is about what love represents for them, like what it's rejecting or what it's rebelling against because they can be in love.
Yeah.
And in this case, the movie very clearly brings it home. Like we talked a little bit before about there is a section of this movie that is about a completely separate subject that has nothing to do with romance, but does have to do with
the byproduct of romance.
Sure, yeah. and women in this time in history and what they would have to do to assert their decision of who they want to be in the world and who they don't want to be, right? And I think it's really hard, kind of like in Little Women, there's a moment when Joe talks about stories that get written, and is it that you write about a thing because you know people want to read it, or do people want to read it because you've primed them by what you choose to write about? And like, if you chose to focus on other events or other things in the world, would you change the tide of what audiences relate to, what they empathize with?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this movie is about the restlessness that these women feel in this time of their life of like, how can I have agency? How can I come into my own self and like assert what I want and what I don't want? And I think the romance and the other event that we won't spoil both kind of fall into that, of things of people choosing, this is who I am and what I want in the world, and this is my like tiny act of rebellion where I get to decide who I get to be in this world that is determined by other people. Otherwise. So I think like there's the romance, but then there's all the other things that the romance means to them. And I think the things that it means kind of start to outshadow the details, right?
Yeah.
So the Romeo and Juliet effect of like, they were only together for a week, and do I really buy that in the 3 days they're explicitly romantic, X, Y, and Z happen? I don't know. But the memory to the artist of like what that kind of love meant for them, that is what I believe. And I think that's what page 28 and the music at the end, I think those all build to that really wonderfully, even if the details are kind of more fictionalized or whatever than a very realistic movie would have been.
There's also there's a few subjects that we haven't talked about, and there's one more subject which I'll still continue to ambiguously state that this film sort of deals with, but doesn't really dive in deep enough, and sort of characters makes decisions which sort of counter what I would believe a character who has this understanding would do. Sorry, I'm speaking incredibly ambiguously, but you referenced Little Women, and the context of this film are the character being portraited. She wouldn't be the Joe character; she would be the Florence Pugh character.
Right.
And what we know about what happened to the Joe character sort of is like this other thing that hangs over this film and talks about your ability to control your fate in the situation. And there's once again, this is like another thing that this film dives into and presents this idea of the character we are watching is put in here because of actions another character did and is now stuck in a life that is out of her control because of an action that somebody else took to take control of their life.
Right.
And it's like this film plays with so many interesting ideas, and each one of these interesting ideas makes me sit forward in my chair and go, let's see what you're going to do with this. And then we spend time dealing with that other subject matter that we're not talking about. And I found it hard to find one cohesive narrative in this film, and instead a bunch of interesting ideas that, while very intriguing, are sort of too far apart to really make me understand the true thesis of this film, as opposed to a bunch of interesting concepts that are being brought up.
Right. So can we talk about the ghost moments
Yeah.
in this movie? So it took me a while, even though I had seen it before, to realize what those are looking at.
Yeah.
Did that make sense to you by the end of the movie?
It, the imagery was enough for me to sort of think that I understood what it was doing. If I had to reverse engineer those scenes, I don't know why I would place them in those exact moments. Mm-hmm. So there's still a disconnect between what I understand and think the director was doing, but I get the concept of it. But I was more just shocked by like the beauty of those shots.
Yeah.
Like it's a breathtaking sort of presentation, especially given the color palette of this film,
right?
Which is like very, very just dingy, dark, and sort of like,
this is maybe the only like bright white in the whole movie. This part, and
it's really like a very it's moments of just sort of like out of nowhere, boom, there you have this shining imagery, and it's very impressive, and it makes you kind of sit back and go like, wow. And then you kind of go, huh? Okay, where are we going now?
Yep.
And especially there's one moment where it happens where somebody's standing on the other side of a doorwell, and like those sort of like so close together things make me kind of shake my head and wonder.
Well, there's also a stated history involving a sister that kind of, I think, can make you believe that you're looking at something very different than what you're looking at.
That's the thing I was sort of offhandedly referencing before, but
yeah. Because that, to me, those, especially watching it a second time, it builds so much the feeling of this being about a kind of preemptive memory, you know, and the realization that this movie is being told or being remembered in the future by like present day version of Marianne, right?
So you're saying there's like the painter was visited by aliens who speak through ink.
Sure.
Sorry, that was a really stupid joke for anybody who's seen Arrival.
Yeah, this is the Arrival. Yeah, but there's this sense of like, even in the middle of like a romance that is about to bloom, you're being haunted by the eventuality of it instead of the memory of it becomes like a thing that is haunting you during. And I thought there was just something really interesting there.
Which is also an interesting subject if you can completely abstract away from this film, right? You have like the marshmallow problem, right? Like, do you want to eat your marshmallow now, or do you want to wait an hour and then have 2 marshmallows? But what if you wait an hour and there's no marshmallows, right? It's like, is this a subconscious projection of like, eventually I will not be able to have this thing that maybe in this moment I don't fully want,
right? But
the fleetingness of it and this sort of imagery of it being out of my grasp makes me need that more. Mm-hmm.
And this is also where it does really tie back to the Greek tragedy that they talk about, because the whole story of the tragedy is that Orpheus cannot look back, right? He's like Lot or whatever. He's being told not to do this. And then they're theorizing, why does this happen? And eventually one of the characters says, maybe she told him to turn around. Maybe she told him to look back. And the last moment that these two characters share in the film is turn around. And that image is what we're seeing burned in through the rest of the movie, right? Of that choice, the like, this is me now and I'm going to vanish. I think there's something, I still don't even know what it means, but there's something very interesting about that thought that I think kind of it percolates in my brain after I watch this movie of what is this saying about agency and about what you're choosing versus what is forced upon you.
And even outside of agency, these two exist in a vacuum for 5 days where there is no outside influence. There's just them being able to enjoy their time together, and time passes as they want to perceive it. They can draw it out as much as they want. They can go to sleep early and time travel to another day. Like, and this this sort of apparition of the reality of time is about to be ending is sort of like it's a manifestation of a ticking clock that is like, oh, this isn't just forever in this moment. This is about to abruptly come to an end, and it's something we're going to have to reckon with, but we are only talking about our eventuality as this concept, as opposed to something that we actually have control over. So,
right. Yeah. Two last things I would say about the movie. One is that I love the scene where the painter is revealing to Eloise the things she knows about her from observing her, like what she does when she's nervous, what she does when she doesn't know what to say. And then Eloise turns it and says what she reveals about her. I think that really brings the idea of love being about truly seeing the other person. And like, if you could fully take in what the other person is, you would almost inevitably fall in love with them. Like, I think that's a really beautiful idea, and the scene plays it really well. And then the final moment in this movie, I don't want to spoil it, except like Call Me By Your Name, someone goes through a whole range of emotions at one time without any words happening. Yeah. And I think that's just a winning formula.
Yeah. And it's a performance like at the end of Good Time, where it's a single person having to do a shit ton of work that is completely, there's nothing written. It's just pure performance that only works because your journey up until that moment.
They're doing the exhale for the movie that you watched afterwards. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that probably brings us to our verdicts for the film. Stephen Miller, I think I know where we're going with this, but if you're going to do this a must-see, a recommend with a caveat, wait for rental, pass with a caveat, or a must-avoid, what would you give it?
This is definitely a must-see for me. I had joked multiple times about this being the kind of classic artsy-fartsy movie, the Rochelle of Seinfeld fame that critics loved because it was a sexual awakening of a young woman, blah, blah, blah. But watching this movie a second time, like it holds up phenomenally well. I think it just is so romantic without ever being exploitative or gratuitous, or it isn't doing the things that your typical, like, this is my lesbian romance film would do. It isn't relying heavily on anything. There isn't like heavy nudity. It is nowhere near as overtly erotic as I remembered. It is so much about the feeling of falling in love and the feeling of wanting. And I think the director just does so much with that while showing so little that it's just a really, to me, incredible movie about the feeling of the preemptive nostalgia that you feel when you are falling in love and you know that it won't last. And I just think that's a really beautiful thing.
If I will say this, if you are going to see this film in theaters, pick an old theater that only old people go to, because there is a scene involving a mirror that young people just will not be able to handle. Luckily, my theater, there was a little bit of tee-hee in the theater that I saw it in, but definitely it rang as strange to some folk, and they were unable to contain their tee-hees.
Definitely the most actual erotic part of the movie, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, take that, Rose and Jack.
Yeah.
But anyway, so for my review, it's, I think if I'm honest with myself, there's a lot of good ideas in this film and a lot of interesting things. But as I said at the beginning, before I tried to like talk about all the things that were really, really positive, not everything worked in this film for me. So I'm going to have to lower it down to a wait for rental. Mm-hmm. I don't want to take anything directly away from this film. I appreciate some of the really brilliant moments in this. I think the ending is amazing. I think there's really interesting ideas at the beginning. There's a lot of stuff in the middle that I'm sort of like outside of, like, I get that things were happening during this time and it was tough. It doesn't work as a cohesive narrative to me. So for me, I didn't walk out of it really being gripped, but there are moments that still stick with me now as we're talking about it. So it's like a wait for rental with a caveat.
Yep. I feel ya.
But yeah, that is our review of Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Stephen Miller, if people want to find you throughout the week, where can they do that?
People can find me at twitter.com/sdavidmiller or sdavidmiller.com.
People can find me at ChristopherInRealLife.com or Twitter.com/ChristopherIRL. You can find the podcast over at thespoilerwarning.com, where you can get a bunch of the back episodes of the show. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do so on Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts are found. If you want to know when the episodes go live, you can follow us at Twitter.com/SpoilerWarning, Facebook.com/TheSpoilerWarning, or Instagram.com/TheSpoilerWarning. If you want to get a hold of us directly, you can send an email to fans@thespoilerwarning.com, or you can use the contact form on our site. Music for this episode will come from the soundtrack to Portrait of a Lady on Fire, so hopefully it's all those women around the fire singing, because that scene was fucking amazing.
Oh, yeah.
And we haven't talked about it yet, but...
That in 1917 are just the two a cappella music scenes of the year, I think.
It was pretty amazing. Like, for a second, I was like, did the soundtrack to Dunkirk just start playing? What's the... Because it was doing, like, the Raise Forever thing, and then the... started happening, and I was like, fuck, this is amazing. I love this movie. But anyways, that hopefully is playing right now. I haven't checked the soundtrack yet. But yes, this is our review of Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Hopefully you enjoyed that. And then we are going to go take off. And by take off, I mean stop this track and then start recording a second one so we can talk about a little film called The Assistant. Bye.
Bye.